I just picked that over there.
So welcome to session 2, The Voice Crying in the Wilderness. And we're going to explore some things about John the Baptizer in this session.
When we do not have the words, God of wisdom,
May
we
we
remain silent.
Oh,
When our words may betray us, bringing harm to others and ourselves, may we remain silent. When someone else has the words we wish we had, then we may listen and learn. May we remain silent. But when ours is the only voice, revealing truth and hope, loosen our tongues that we may speak out. When the voices of others are stifled or ignored, may we advocate for them.
May we speak out.
May we speak out. When the promise of Advent is swamped by money and glitz, inspire us and move us that we may speak out, speak the story of hope, peace, and of new birth. Amen.
So today we're going to meet John the Baptizer, cousin of Jesus, desert-dwelling preacher, first-century prophet of doom, and founder of a religious movement. All of those things and perhaps more we will discover. In the material that some of you have been poring over for days and some of you have only just received in the last 10 minutes, sorry about there was a set of questions looking at these 3 passages. Now, many of you may be used to it, may be new to some, but hopefully most of you are used to this idea of the synopsis, the parallels columns, putting the same story in Matthew, Mark and Luke alongside of each other, and even doing it so that you can tell line by line what's similar and what's different. So we're looking in particular at the middle column, Mark, the earliest and shortest gospel, which was in all likelihood, high likelihood, the source for Matthew and Luke, each using it independently. So we're looking at Mark, and then in the right-hand column, we're looking at Luke. And there's a set of questions about how John is portrayed in Mark's account, and then compare what happens to the way John is described in Luke's account. What material is in Luke that is not in Mark, and what material is in Mark but not in Luke. And then the arrows show you something about the order, and there's a bit of a reordering going on in Luke. And if you get to it, then there's questions about the quotation, the scripture quotation. So this is all going to happen in breakout rooms, so we'll give you a decent amount of time, and then you can jump back out and we'll talk a bit about what you've discovered.
Selves short. So let us look at this material and see what you have discovered. So how is John described in Mark 1, and what does Luke do with that description? I think that's a pretty straightforward one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mark tells us what he looks like he's clothed in camel's hair and has a leather belt around his waist, and he eats locusts, and as we pointed out, fortunately with honey rather than without.
Yes.
Luke doesn't have any of that. That's not important to Luke.
No.
Now, obviously, locusts, I understand, are a good source of protein, and they're free and plentiful. So, why not? But yes, Luke leaves all of that out. Mark often does have descriptions that you find that Luke and or Matthew don't include. If you look at the stilling of the storm, and if you look at the demoniac in the graveyard, you'll see what I mean. So why do you think Luke has reordered the material when compared with Mark? Because he's changed it around. He's brought the quote down to the end, and he's put talking about the repentance of baptism. He shifted that slightly. That's above the quote now. Why do you think he's doing that?
Well, he starts off by...
Sorry.
Go on.
I think he's addressing a different audience.
Different audience?
Yeah, so I think he's probably more Gentiles who are not so concerned about prophets following a line of prophecy. So he's more concerned about what's happening now and the theological points, and then
Except
brings in their prophecy later.
Okay. Carolyn, you were going to say something?
Well, Luke anchors it in a particular time frame and a historical context so that, you know, it makes it sound very factual.
Yeah, he does. He's got all of that stuff about Tiberius and Pilate and who the tetrarchs were and where they were ruling and who the high priests were. And then he comes to John. So, yes, it is set in a very specific context.
And who his father was.
And
You know,
who his
so
father was.
he's identifying, you know, very clearly.
Yeah,
Who
so
his
John's
father
son of
was.
Zechariah. And of course, Luke is the only one who tells that story of Zechariah. And if you look in your lectionary readings, you'll see that Zechariah's song is the psalm for this Sunday. And that's the song he sings when he is finally gets his speech back. Because, of course, he loses it because he
That's right.
doesn't quite insult the angel, but close enough. So he's struck dumb until the child is born, and then he gets his speech back. So that song he sings is when that happens. And that's unique to Luke.
Elizabeth,
Yes.
my sister told me when she was doing ancient history at university that for a long time they thought that was a false, Luke's account was false about who was ruling at the one time. And then later on they found a fragment, they found that one of those was in actual fact ruling at the same time as the others, just for a short period of time. Is my memory of that correct?
I think Luke makes a mistake in Acts. Now, John would know that better than me, but I think what he's written here is correct. Is that right, John?
That's as I understand it, yeah.
Yeah.
It correlates with other information, yeah.
Yeah. Drew, you've got your hand up?
I do. It just occurred to me with regard to why he changed the order and the baptism was first and the quote last. He was writing for a completely different audience, and I think his intent was to make a sort of detailed, logical account of everything relating to Christ. And I think because of those two things, the baptism was the most important issue. And then he put a complete version from Isaiah, I think it was Isaiah 43-5, whereas the others just basically did Isaiah 43, I think.
Yeah, he's got the end of the quote in. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Isaiah. Yeah, he does.
Yeah. So I
what
think
is
he's trying to give a complete picture, but starting with the baptism because that's what his audience would firstly relate to, and that would be of more importance to them.
Hmm.
Okay, so what do you think the significance of having that scripture quotation is in relation to John? And Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have a version of this quotation.
We felt that because his audience might be Gentiles and less familiar with that quote, he put it in full to give it more context, maybe.
Yeah, that would be one way of understanding it. So, I mean, if we're looking at Luke, the way Luke, Mark, and Matthew quote Isaiah from the Old Testament, they're actually suggesting that John is fulfilling a prophecy here. So that's the first point. And I think the second point is all flesh shall see the salvation of God. Think about Luke's theology and think about that.
Yep.
And how do people see those two things?
Well, it circles back to the baptism that he started with, really. It all relates to that current sort of thing of Jesus and following Jesus and being baptized and saved.
It does, but who does it relate to?
Other people other than Jews?
Yes, exactly, Sue. That's right. Other people other than Jews, all flesh shall see the salvation of God.
Right.
It's picking up Luke's universal kind of themes. Because in Luke, you find that everyone's welcome. Look at the story of the banquet.
Yes.
When the Jews don't come, he sends them out, the messengers out into the laneways and outside of the city, which has always been understood as a sort of metaphor for going outside of Judaism and looking at Gentiles. And a lot of Luke's parables and things he tells involve races other than Jews, such as Samaritans. So it's thought that he's added this quote, all flesh shall see the salvation of God, because God is there for everyone, where in Matthew you would not find such a quote. Matthew leaves it off, of course.
And Mark.
And Mark.
And Mark, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the whole of 5 and 6 in Luke is verses 5 and 6 in Luke is actually missing from the other two.
Yeah,
that's right. And Luke's genealogy goes back to Adam, which indicates that it's sort of the God of all people, where Matthew's, for instance, goes back to Abraham, who's the father of the Jews.
But we want to know whether John was descended from David as well.
It's never stated anywhere that he is, so probably not, or it would be made a thing of, I would have thought.
Yeah, because he must have been a cousin on the other side then.
Yeah, if he wasn't,
I think Elizabeth was related to Mary, and the line from David comes through Joseph, doesn't it?
Yes, that's correct. That's right. And of course, the gospel writers, only Luke says that they're related. They might have been, they might not have been. We really have no way of proving this. And these stories are only found in Luke about Elizabeth and Zechariah, are only found in Luke. Having said that, that John was the son of a priest named Zechariah does appear in other literature. It's in the Gospel of the Ebionites, and it's also found in some of the Mandean literature that you're going to hear James talk about when we get to that. So we've got one.
I was going to just push on to the next question.
Yeah, we can push on. That's what I was about to do, the apocalypse.
Yeah, so last week we heard Jesus talking about the signs in the heavens and people fainting from fear and foreboding. And when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, your redemption is drawing near. And we thought about Jesus in the tradition of the prophetic apocalyptic stream, talking about what needs to be done in the light of God's coming judgment. And of course, not in this section of the story, but as the story goes on, John really enters into that stream of things. You brood of vipers, he says, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bear fruits worthy of repentance. So we're just wondering, how do you think John the Baptizer relates to the apocalyptic teachings that we saw in Jesus, especially as we were thinking about that last week? I think there's a connection there.
Oh yeah. Okay. Those of you who said, oh yeah, would you like to unpack that and say why you think there's a connection?
Well, I think you picked up on all of that: punishment, end of the times, you're going to get your just dues type of thing that is coming across in Jesus, the apocalyptic Jesus. I think that was very much his message. It was all repent, or else, So he seems very apocalyptic to me.
John does suit the picture of apocalypse with his clothing and his habits, doesn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. Any other comments on that?
What did he talk about? The wrath to come?
The wrath to come, yes. Which would suggest probably the day of the Lord, where it was expected not only the good would be rewarded, but the evil or wicked would be punished, or, the wrath of God would be turned on them.
So people tend to gloss over those predictions, especially since it didn't come true that it happened within a generation. And I think, someone said to me that, the church is cherry picking, and that makes them, dubious about the authenticity of what we say.
Yeah, and that's a fair point, because Jesus says clearly in 3 Gospels that this generation will not taste death, or something like that. Those who are standing here will not taste death before I return. And I was looking at Philippians this morning with our lectionary cafe, and Paul says it too. It's clear that Paul expects Jesus back in his lifetime, and that will be something that's happening soon. This day of the Lord is coming soon. And it didn't happen. And the fact that Paul's picking it up, some scholars have tried to explain it by saying, well, obviously Jesus must have been talking about his resurrection. Well, I would say two things to that. One is Jesus talks about coming with angels on clouds and all the nations lining up before him. That clearly did not happen in the resurrection. And the second is Paul is talking about this return. And Paul is writing after the resurrection, and he's converted after the resurrection. So it's unlikely that he understood it as the resurrection. So probably Jesus didn't either, and neither did his followers. But it's just one of those conundrums that scholars like to fight about, really. How could Jesus be wrong?
So, as was indicated in the email to you, in this morning's session, we were joined by a friend of ours from the United States. It was 10 o'clock in the morning here, but it was 6 o'clock at night there for James. So he, what we did was record that, because for him to be joining us now, he'd have to be getting up at 3:30 in the morning. And
we thought that a bit unreasonable.
So we've recorded the conversation that we had this morning, and we're going to play that now. And so unfortunately you won't be able to ask James questions, but you can ask us questions about what James said if you like.
Yes.
So we'll hop into that now. Evening in Indiana. So I sent the copy of what is said about you on your university website to people so that they know who you are and where you fit into things. Elizabeth and I have known James for nearly 25 years now, since we were spending the year in Durham in the UK. And James, amongst a number of the things that he does in terms of his academic interests, if you're into sci-fi and Star Trek and Star Wars and all of that stuff, we could have you back for another go with those people like Elizabeth that are really into that.
Yeah, right, John. Just because I do a podcast on Star Trek does not a Trekkie make me.
Yeah, so that's one of James's interests, but John the Baptist and the Mandaeans, which we will get to, is another. So what do we know about John, and how do we know it, is the basic kind of historical question that we might start with, James.
Yes, and I'll say a bit about what I'm going to be doing about that and how I'm turning my attention to that increasingly recently, and planning to do even more on the subject. So as John has hinted, I have wide-ranging and diverse interests, which either means I'm one of these creative minds or that I have a very short attention span. And it may be that those are just kinder and not so kind ways of saying the same thing. But I've managed to explore a number of things that were not directly related, shall we say, to what I started out doing, which was New Testament early Christianity. In fact, when I met John and Elizabeth, I was working on the Gospel of John. But one of the things that you encounter if you study the Gospel of John and dig into it in great detail is the group known as the Mandaeans. And they got a lot of attention in the first half of the 20th century, particularly in German scholarship, from scholars of the New Testament who thought these might be the descendants of the followers of John the Baptist, and so maybe we can plug them in as background to the New Testament and everything will make sense. And when that idea went out of fashion, so did a lot of scholarly interest in the Mandaeans. But just very briefly, and I'll happily say more about them, they are, in essence, the last surviving Gnostic group that made it from ancient times down to the present day. And they have a high regard for a number of biblical characters, including John the Baptist, but they're not such big fans of Jesus. And that's a very unusual belief system right there. And so the question of whether they might be related in some way to groups of followers that remained sort of faithful to and allied with John the Baptist and didn't turn their attention to Jesus afterwards is an interesting question. And I'll have more to say about that. At any rate, I got involved in exploring this side topic, but kept coming back, of course, to my main field, which is New Testament. And so recently wrote a book on what Jesus learned from women. And there's a story behind that, which I'll happily tell you again if there's interest. So one thing I should say is that I teach both at Butler University, which is not a religiously affiliated school, and in my church in a Sunday school class for adults. And so I'm used to speaking in both contexts to a range of audiences, but one thing that they both have in common is that I'm always open to those present detouring me away from what I thought was interesting, but wasn't interesting to anyone else, to things that actually are interesting to those present. And so I do want to encourage you to do so.
So if people want to detour James, you need to signal somehow, unmute yourself and ask a question, signal, yeah.
Can I ask people actually to use the hand function? If you go down to the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions thing with a little smiley face. If you click on that, you'll see there's a bar that says raise hand with a yellow hand. I'll do it now. You can see my hand's gone up. If you do that, you'll come automatically to the top of the screen, and John and I will be able to see you, and you can ask James your question. Everyone got that? Excellent.
And I put one up there briefly with a halo just to give a sort of saintly impression of myself, because that hopefully will last even if I say controversial things. But one question that I got asked when I was doing a podcast with, I think it was a local radio station. I'm trying to remember who it was I was actually talking with, but their last question was, so what are you going to do next? What Jesus learned from men? And my response was, well, actually, maybe, kind of, because one place that I was thinking of going next was to take the work I've done on the Mandaeans and my interest in the historical Jesus and bring those together to explore the figure of John the Baptist. And while I don't think we can use the Mandaean sources in the sort of simplistic way, the overly embracing of everything way that New Testament scholars sometimes did, including some scholars that you may have heard of, Rudolf Bultmann, who critically analyzed the New Testament, nonetheless would take the things that we found in Mandaean sources and assume they go back to John the Baptist, right? And because that wasn't his field, and so just took that stuff over. But I think that if you've looked at any of the sort of Christian Gnostic texts, things they found at Nag Hammadi, if we didn't have the New Testament Gospels, they would give us a very different impression of Jesus. And we might say, well, they distort him in significant ways. But if we didn't have much else to go on, we probably could dig our way back to Jesus in significant ways. And so that's really what I'm suggesting. Not that John the Baptist was himself a Gnostic or had the kinds of views that they had, but that these sources are relevant, because turning now and showing how this is relevant to what John actually asked me, and that I'm not just already off on a tangent. How do we know things about John the Baptist? The truth is that what the New Testament tells us is relatively little. We also have a statement in the Jewish historian Josephus, which again tells us very little. And each of those has been accused of presenting John in a particular way that serves their interests. And we'll see some of that as we look at the New Testament evidence. And so we don't have a lot to go on. And so if we have additional sources that may be useful, even if we can only get a few details from them, that's potentially significant. But one thing that I think is also significant is that the Mandaeans as a living group, one that has a significant representation, a significant population in Australia, we can look at their lived practice, which is pretty unique in terms of ancient Gnosticism. And some of the things that they do, because baptism, immersion in running water, in Aramaic living water, is their central ritual, I think they can raise some possibilities about what John might have done that might not occur to us otherwise if we just were approaching through the lens, not just of the New Testament, but of Christian baptism and Christian ways of doing things and Christian assumptions. And so if nothing else, looking at those sources raises some possibilities about how we might connect the dots and figure things out about John the Baptist.
Okay, so you say that Josephus doesn't tell us much about John the Baptist.
Doesn't tell us much, no. And I can't remember whether you included.
I did include the excerpt from Book 18 of the Antiquities, and often Josephus is cited. You know, the arguments about the historicity of the biblical texts are if there's some evidence from outside of Christian writers, then that raises the likelihood of there being historical. So, you know, the arguments about did Jesus exist, that I know is another one of your interests, arguing with people that say Jesus didn't exist, it was all a Christian mock-up. There are sources outside of Christianity, although not quite as contemporary as Jesus. The same with John. Josephus is really important for some people to say, look, John wasn't just a figure made up as like a foil to Jesus by the Christian writers. John was actually cited in Josephus' work, and Josephus isn't making that up. So that's the importance of Josephus.
That's one of the things. And I think, or let me put it this way, I'm hoping that historians are increasingly moving away from an older way of doing things. Elizabeth took a shot at the Jesus Seminar, which certainly does reflect one approach, which really is a sort of atomistic one, right? You sort of take each individual saying and maybe just word by word and go through it. And what they did famously was put some of those in red, like the red letter editions, and then some in pink, some in gray, some in black. And what a lot of historians have started to grapple with more seriously is that we remember the gist of what happened, and we remember the gist of a story better than we remember the details. Sometimes there are things like, if you remember a joke, oftentimes it will vary with each retelling, but the punchline, the wording may be very important, right? And in the same way we see that sometimes Jesus had these memorable sayings that were attributed to him. But instead of looking at each individual saying and trying to sift whether they're authentic, and then discovering that, like little balls of different colors, you could assemble them into lots of different pictures. That actually what we need to look at is the overall impression first. And so if we have Josephus and a number of Christian sources and potentially the Mandaean sources, then I think that can let us triangulate and sort of see the ripples of John's impact and trace them back to their source. And
so
that's
what about the Dead Sea Scrolls then? Is John in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, if you've ever visited Qumran, and if you haven't, I encourage you to do so. It's an amazing place. But I remember vividly the first time I went there, because it was not with a guided tour. They just sort of shuffled us into a room, and they start out by playing a movie that tries to recreate life in that community. And one member of the community says, didn't Herod kill a man named John? Wasn't there a John who used to be with us? And they have all this, so they're buying into this and trying to connect the story of that place with this figure from Christianity. On the one hand, it's not clear that John was ever part of that group among the Dead Seas, by the Dead Sea, the Essenes at Qumran, or the wider group of Essenes that apparently lived elsewhere. But there are enough things that they have in common that's a reasonable possibility. Either way, John, on the one hand, bears similarities, and once we've detected enough of those, I think we can perhaps use the Dead Sea Scrolls rather, to fill in some of the picture, right? And especially if we see, and this is one idea I have, which has yet to be tested fully. I'm hoping to write a book on this next year, due for a sabbatical. So I reserve the right to change my mind about any of this over the next year and a half. But anyway, one thing that I'm thinking is that because there are similarities between John and the Dead Sea Scrolls, as between John and Jesus, if there's something that we don't have attributed to John, but we find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in Jesus, I think it's reasonable to posit John as the intermediary of those things. And that might allow us to fill in more of the picture of John. And so their emphasis on immersion, their offering of an alternative to sacrifice in the temple. There are a number of things that are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that certainly seem to characterize John and be associated with him. But ideas flow even among people who are not necessarily part of a group. And so it's much harder to determine that John actually spent time as part of that community.
Yeah. So saying that you don't have to go and bring your sacrifices to the temple, but that you can come to this community out at Qumran outside of Jerusalem, and you can worship God and be part of God's people there. That's one point of connection. John wasn't in the temple and wasn't part of that, even though, according to Luke, his father was of the priestly group. And then the fixation with water. There's a lot of water used at Qumran. And John, of course, does his major activity by dunking people in the water. I like to tell people that baptism actually means dunk, to totally immerse in the water. So there are those kind of points of similarity. We don't have them tied down in a specific text, but we have the same kind of interests and activities happening.
Yes, so one area that really deserves more study than it's gotten, there's been a little work done on it, but not as much as it deserves. You'll find, I may just say that this one last time and then say this applies to everything I say about the Mandaeans, because their texts on the whole have not been given the attention they deserve. But they have stories not just about John the Baptist, but they also have an account of portents, signs preceding his birth, and mention his father being Zechariah and his mother being Elizabeth. Enishbai is the way it's pronounced in the Mandaic language, which is a dialect of Aramaic. And he's a priest there too. And one of the things that the priests are troubled by is that this child is going to be born, and they view him as sort of bad news for the temple and for the priesthood and for the Torah. And that raises interesting questions. Even if we think that John was not at the extreme that Gnosticism went to, he certainly does seem to be offering an alternative to temple sacrifice. If he were just offering an immersion for purification of the sort that people were widely practicing, then he wouldn't have the nickname that he has, right? He's doing something that means it's worth calling him the immerser or the dunker or whatever you prefer. John the Dipper.
John the Dipper.
Person, right, who is doing something with water that not everybody's doing. And they question his authority to do that. And if he's just doing ritual immersion for purity that everybody's doing, then that issue doesn't come up. And that's maybe my favorite example of where the Mandaean living practice can inform our exploration of this and suggest something interesting. Mandaean immersion, Mandaean baptism, is not a once-for-all conversion thing. This is something that they practice daily, and they practice, sort of communally. They do that daily, individually, when they have access to flowing water. It has to be flowing water, which in Aramaic is living water. And they also celebrate major festivals, and they do this as a way of seeking forgiveness and connection with the light world, with heaven, essentially. And the idea of water connecting heaven and earth, of course, is widely found. But the idea that it brings forgiveness is not something that you find everywhere. And John does seem to be offering an alternative to sacrifice. And sacrifice is not something you only do once and then it's taken care of, at least as far as animal sacrifice in the temple is concerned. And so that repeated immersion might actually give us a sense of something closer to what John actually did. If the traditions that his father was a priest were correct, then on the one hand, that might have seemed to give him like the credentials, the background, the lineage to be able to do something priestly that wasn't sacrifice. But on the other hand, I'm guessing he and his father may not have had a particularly good relationship. Might not have seen eye to eye on this. And there's something very interesting there, because one of the places where John and Jesus sort of are compared in the Gospels, it's in a saying that actually, at least implicitly, has parents and children's relationship to parents in the picture as well.
Well, of course, Elizabeth and Zechariah were supposed to be old when he was born, weren't they? So whether they actually got to engage with the adult son,
there you go.
Is another question, I guess. Yeah. So
the same question comes up about Jesus as well, of course.
So So is the so read chapters 2 and 3, I think it is, of what Jesus learned from women, about what Jesus learned from his mother and from his grandmother. hypothetically, yeah. So the real point of connection between John and the Mandaeans, apart from the fact that he's mentioned in their texts, is water, is the use of water. And that's a major point of connection with the Essenes, presuming they were Essenes in the Qumran community, that water was used. So it's interesting then that water sits not only at the beginning of Genesis in Hebrew scriptures, but water sits at the beginning of Mark's account, where you have John and Jesus. So it's like this primal religious symbol, all of which could be used to say you're making far too much of the connection. You know, water was just something that was important to everyone. So what else is it from Mandaeanism? Is it the specific mention of John?
I think that's part of it. I mean, I think that otherwise you could look at texts from India where they practice immersion and connected with hope for the afterlife and things like that. And of course, because of the Silk Road and the flow of traditions and teachings and people along those routes, it's not impossible that there could have been influence and things like that. But trying to trace those often becomes extremely speculative. And a lot of times it's not necessary, because water as something that cleanses, water as something that connects earth and heaven, you don't need a direct connection with some other text or group in order to come up with that, right? The very stuff itself can do that. But the Mandaean texts mention John. They talk about baptism in living water and use that phrase. They talk about a lot about light and darkness in the way that the Gospel of John does. They call baptismal water, they use the term Yardna, right? In other words, Jordan for this. And so there are terminological connections that are interesting. And then they blame the destruction of Jerusalem on the persecution of Mandaeans by Jewish authorities, which is interesting as well. And I can't see this group in later times located in Mesopotamia blaming it on, blaming the destruction of a city that's far away on persecution of these people. There's no obvious reason to do that. And so I think there are things in the Mandaean Book of John that probably are remnants of historical memory of some sort. And I'll be spending the next year and a half or so sifting through those and making a case for them. But some of them, as I worked on translating the Mandaean Book of John, are already on my radar. And among them, one thing that's interesting is that the Mandaeans have an account of John baptizing Jesus. And he doesn't want to, not because he doesn't think he's worthy, but because he thinks that Jesus is going to depart from his teachings and basically become, start his own movement, which of course he does.
So that's pretty full-on stuff. Yeah, that's one of the excerpts you suggested.
Yeah.
John saying to Jesus when he comes, "You have lied to Jews, you have deceived men, the priests, you have cut seed off from men and labour and pregnancy from women. You have loosened the Sabbath that Moses ordained in Jerusalem. You lied to them with a horn and played different things with the trumpet." I've never thought of Jesus as the jazz trumpeter gone rogue. But anyway, that's an interesting image. Yeah. But there's a lot of stuff in those just 4 or 5 lines that resonates with Jewish criticisms of Jesus in the Gospels, for instance.
Yeah. Yes, and that phrase, right, loosing the Sabbath, is pretty much exactly what we find in Greek in the Gospel of John.
Yes. Yeah.
And one reason I think there's some historical memory there is precisely the fact that the Mandaeans, as Gnostics, don't think highly of the Torah and of Moses. And so the fact that John, who they esteem, is accusing Jesus of doing this thing that a Mandaean, you wouldn't expect to be criticizing someone else for doing, makes me think that they may actually have incorporated into their traditions things that go back to a time before they were Gnostic, essentially. On the other hand, the fact that in both the form of Mandaeism as well as in other forms of Gnosticism, you get these things emerging around John and around Jesus, makes me wonder whether John, as somebody who offers an alternative to the Torah ordained means of forgiveness and things like that, wasn't something that sparked the possibility of bypassing Torah, bypassing these texts or understanding them this other way. So there are lots of lots of questions that we may not be able to answer. But in addition to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Mandaean texts in this research project about John the Baptist, there's one other source that I think has been neglected for John the Baptist. And one thing that I think most of us would take for granted is that even though a student doesn't always follow in lockstep with their teacher and their teaching, the influence of a teacher on their student nonetheless is usually discernible in some way or another. And so the possibility that Jesus, as John's most famous disciple, right, might actually himself have clues that he can provide us with about what John taught, what he emphasized, is also, I think, worth exploring. A couple of people have mentioned the fact that, according to our sources taken together, Jesus doesn't even start his activity until after John is thrown into prison. But in the Gospel of John, that's not the case.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting is that John, the Gospel of John, I'll try and be specific and not say John, but you've got John Squires, John's Gospel, John the Baptist, and
yes,
not sure many others. So I'll try and be specific. But in the Gospel of John, the action of Jesus and his words about the temple are moved up towards the beginning. And they're situated, therefore, at a time when Jesus is actually, at least for all intents and purposes, or at least could be perceived as still part of John's movement. And so, given that John was teaching that you could find forgiveness by some means other than the temple, could Jesus' message, right, destroy this temple, or I will destroy this temple and rebuild it, have been, in essence, a message from John? Could that reflect his teaching? The gospel suggests that Jesus' teaching mirrored John's in some ways, right? Matthew summarizes his message and John's message and Jesus' message in the same way, and even attributes similar phrases to them.
And so that's interesting that in John's gospel, the actions and words of Jesus in relation to the temple come really early on, whereas in the other three, it's right at the end in that last visit, in entry on Passover into Jerusalem. John brings it up forward. You're saying that's possibly because, and it's still in the whole nexus of chapters 1, 2, and 3, where John the baptizer is active and present in John's gospel. Yeah. So it could be that influence.
Yeah, and it's not clear whether, which of those is historical, like the Synoptics or John. Oftentimes you'll hear that it's 3 against 1, and so we should go with the 3. But it's actually, we've got Mark's placement of it, followed by Matthew and Luke, and we've got John's Gospel's placement of it. And so either in principle is possible. One thing that I'm really struck by, and I at least want to say is intriguing, is that the Jewish authorities who challenge Jesus when he carries out this symbolic action, driving out the money changers and the animals from the temple, is they say, this temple, has been under construction for 36 years, and that would put that at basically the start of a 3-year activity, according to John's chronology, right? Yes. If we start when the renovation started, right, that Herod started, and so there's at least it's close enough to being right that it makes me think maybe there's something to this, but at the very least, I think that some of the things that are attributed to Jesus. Maybe saying, that, a time is coming when people will worship neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, and things like that. And emphasizing living water, which we also find in Mandaean sources, that it may be that more of what Jesus taught and did reflects things that John also taught and did. And so that, I think, may also help us to fill in the picture a bit more.
So chapter 1 of John's Gospel, not the word prologue, but the narrative about the testimony given by John and then disciples interacting, that may well be a way of, that might well have more historical value than scholars have often given to John's Gospel. This might be, the story that's told there might actually reflect a history of Jesus being a student of John, and then Jesus is the baptism a kind of rite of progression, a rite of moving from being a student to setting out, having his own movement?
Did he just practice this baptism? I mean, did he do it more than once, the way others may have? There are all kinds of questions you might ask. I think that the Gospel of John depicts John the Baptist as adamantly, without a doubt, convinced that Jesus is the one who's coming after him and who everyone should pay attention to him. And there, it's that famous saying, seems like he protests too much, right? Seems that it's like, he wasn't the light. He was just bearing witness to the light. The true light, it's like, don't look at him, look over here. And even John is made to say that. But he says it in the same style with which Jesus speaks and with which the narrator speaks. And so there's reason to think that what we're hearing there is really the perspective of the evangelist, the gospel author. But the idea that Jesus and some of Jesus' followers, later followers, started and first connected around the figure of John the Baptist has some historical plausibility to it. And one thing that often doesn't happen, right, because we do have to be cautious when we put different gospels together, because sometimes that's like putting pieces from different puzzles together and hoping that one nice, clearer, bigger picture will come out of it, when in fact you're more likely to get a jumbled mess. But one thing that may have puzzled you is that Jesus, according to the Synoptic Gospels, just passes by people and says, things like, come follow me, I'll make you fishers of people, and off they go. And it's like, wow, he must have been a really impressive person, with just the sense of, awe, or maybe he was glowing. And so people were like, oh yeah, that's like, I'm with him from now on. But if those people knew Jesus from that movement, and what we might be witnessing in the stories in the Gospel of John, in the Synoptic Gospels, might be essentially after John's imprisonment, Jesus sort of taking up the reins of that movement and regathering some of John's followers and saying, sort of, we're not done yet.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an interesting story. There are several passages, several things like parables in the Mandaean Book of John. There's one about a good shepherd, which is really interesting. But there's one that is often referred to as the parable of the soul fisher. And I've been struck as I've thought about it that, a fisher of souls, right, and a fisher of people is pretty much saying the same kind of thing. And this depiction of a sort of a figure who stands sort of in a boat and casts his net, sort of catching living beings and sifting through them, rather than, we see some influence of that on sort of Jesus and on the parables that he himself teaches. But on the other hand, if this was a phrase that John used, then saying, come on, you're going to fish people from now on. We're taking up the reins of this. We're not done with this movement. John's been in prison. We're in Galilee, but that might explain some of that in an interesting sort of way. Yeah,
fascinating. I don't know whether you've ever heard of Barbara Thiering, James, but I was actually taught by Barbara Thiering, an Australian biblical scholar, theologian. And her thesis, of course, was that John and Jesus were both part of the Essene movement at Qumran, and that John was the teacher of righteousness, in other words, the leader of that community. And John and Jesus had a barney, had a falling out, had a breakup, and Jesus left. And he was depicted in the Dead Sea Scrolls as the wicked priest. So that there was a strong influence of John on Jesus, but in the very opposite way in which you're talking about, which is to say that Jesus reacted against and left behind what John was on about in that community. Now, that's locating John in that community, not in the Jordan. So that's another reconstruction of Christian origins.
Sure. And that's a good counterexample that students don't always follow in their teacher's footsteps in every regard. And of course, Jesus did do his own thing. The point is not that Jesus did not take things in a different direction, but that there may be more that what Jesus emphasized can tell us about John than we sometimes consider. Most people who look at Jesus and John are interested in what looking at John can tell us about Jesus. And yet, just like when we read Paul's letters, figuring out what those mixed up Corinthians were up to, can help us understand Paul's letter and help us understand what's going on in Corinth, because they're sort of connected in that way. I think that paying attention to John in his own right, using Jesus as a means to understand John more clearly and get a fuller picture, if what you're mainly interested in is understanding Jesus, I think that will help with that as well.
Okay. So I was thinking for a while there that what Jesus learnt from women, the follow-up book, you're saying might be what Jesus, I was thinking it was going to be what Jesus learnt from John the Baptist. But now you're telling us it's what Jesus learnt from John the Baptist and actually tells us about John the Baptist, so to speak, throwing it back.
Yeah, Jesus is going to be part of it. It's not going to be just what Jesus learned from John the Baptist, but how's this for a sentence? What Jesus learned from John the Baptist tells us about John the Baptist.
Right, yes, exactly. I think probably in light of our time, we've still got 20 minutes left, and it would be good to ask if people want to, throw more questions at you. I know that Matt wants to ask something, Elizabeth has indicated.
He does, but it's from the book, What Jesus Learnt from Women. So he's willing to wait until people have asked about John the Baptist.
Okay. So
you owe me a commission, James. I've got them all reading your book.
Does anybody want to make any comments or ask any questions of James in relation to John the Baptist at this point? Stunned silence.
Oh, that's unlike you lot. You're usually all very chatty.
Sorry, I was muted. James, while you've been talking, I've checked you out in Wikipedia. and I discover that you're an expert on Mandeanism, and I've got a connection with St. John Ambulance, the Order of St. John, and the St. John in the Order of St. John is, of course, St. John the Baptist.
Right.
And one of the precious artifacts of the early Order of St. John was the mummified right hand of Jesus, of John, which is said to have baptized Jesus. I don't know what the provenance is, because there are so many bits and pieces of John around the world, no less than one mummified head and another skull. They can't all be John. Could you just briefly explain the Mandean religion to us and how John fits into that, and also does Jesus fit into it?
Sure. Yeah, I've got to hand it to you. That's an interesting way of sort of connecting your background with what we're talking about here. Sorry. I like making puns whenever I can. But in a nutshell, the Mandaeans, although their texts are in a dialect of Aramaic, and so some of the names and figures and things like that are different, the religion is quite a lot like what you may have read about if you've read books like Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels or anything of that sort. They believe that the supreme ultimate source of the universe is good, and since the material world is bad, that somewhere in between that good ultimate source and emanating forth from it, eventually you get at a sufficient distance that something goes wrong, and someone gets this terrible idea of bringing a material world into existence, and that's why the world is in the mess that it is. So it's an interesting approach to the problem of evil, where more mainstream Judaism and Christianity say, well, rebellious humans and rebellious angels and all kinds of powers have messed up God's good creation. What distinguishes Gnosticism, if you want to call it that, some have reservations about the term, but the religious the religions, at least formally and traditionally known as Gnosticism, have in common the belief that this figure, a demiurge, an inferior creator, is responsible for bringing the material world into existence, and that's why it's so messed up. And the aim of the righteous within it is to basically figure out how to connect with that heavenly realm where the sparks that give us life are sort of originate, and figure out how to get past the creator and his henchmen and get back to that celestial realm. And so in Mandaism, something that's not universally found, but we do have mentions of it, but we don't have any chance to see it lived out. Immersion in water is a way both of seeking forgiveness and of connecting with that realm above, right? So the ritual is thought to help with that. And so that's sort of Mandaism and Gnosticism in a nutshell.
Thank you.
Well, are you all suitably stunned now?
Definitely. So is Mandaeanism, does it exist today?
It does, and there's a big community of Mandaeans in Australia. We met James here in 2019 before COVID, actually. He was out from America and he'd come to talk to the community of Mandaeans here in Australia. So yes, they're still around, and they're thought to descend directly from John the Baptist followers. So they're like the Samaritans. They're this other kind of sect, not really Judaism, but from the first century, connected with Judaism.
Are they in a particular location, or are they scattered throughout the community in Australia?
I think they tend to clump in a location. There's not that many of them. And because of their ritual practices, they don't tend to separate out greatly. And they're in more countries than this, but as I said, there's quite a big community of them in Australia. I think they're in Sydney, around in the Sydney region somewhere.
Yeah, can I comment that I read one of the articles that was in the links, and there's quite a big group in Western Sydney.
Are they essentially Aramaic from that origin?
Yes, that was their language that they spoke, and their scriptures are in Aramaic. So yes. Dennis?
I'm sorry, quite a lot of what you said was above me. I've not encountered this kind of area of discussion before. Are you saying that there is a reasonable possibility that for a period of time, Jesus could be thought of as being a disciple of John the Baptist?
Yes, that's right. And that's what a lot of scholars believe, that was the case. And that's the reason why Jesus himself was baptized, because he became part of John's followers. And then he got his own religion kind of inspiration, I guess, and he started his own group of followers. So scholars think that because of that, and the connection Jesus had with John, they're all at pains in the Gospels to distance Jesus from John in logical ways. So John becomes the signpost that points to Jesus, and they all pick up that refrain. But it's quite plausible that, yes, that was the case. Jesus followed John initially. Drew?
I think there's actually a pretty good argument for that. And I read Barbara Fearing's book, and I think it was in that book that I'm awestruck you actually studied under it, John. I thought it was a really interesting book. In that book, I'm pretty sure it was Barbara Fearing that mentioned that when Jesus talks to the fig tree and curses it because it doesn't bear fruit, that there was some sort of connection between the fig tree and the Essenes. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was to do with a figurative sort of thing that was with the Essenes. So it was kind of like a dig at the Essenes in a way, that particular cursing of the fig tree. Is that right? Have I got that right?
The fig tree is one of the symbols of Israel, and the Essenes believed that they were the true Israel, not like what was going on in Jerusalem and the temple, which was false.
Right.
So they took that, yeah. I have to say that even though I was taught by Barbara Thiering, it's not necessarily that that's the line I advocate.
No,
I
get that.
was part of a symposium at Sydney University once where 3 of Barbara's former students, I was one of them, each spoke about why they disagreed with her. And
yeah. There's a fair bit to disagree with.
So it was quite a controversial thesis,
Yeah,
but a very, very creative one, yeah. But the whole idea of water is important at Qumran. Judgment and wrath and righteousness are all part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're quite prominent in it. John uses water. John preaches judgment. John calls for repentance.
Yep.
And lo and behold, Jesus is baptized, and then Jesus says the kingdom is near, repent. So there's kind of interesting connections. And then I'm not sure about the judgment repentance stuff in the Mandaeans, but certainly the water cleansing, faithful
I
life.
certainly see the connections between. I mean, I believe for a long time there's that Essene connection, but then I also sort of think back to when John was in prison, and he seemed to have doubt, and he said, you know, are you who, he sends his men out to say, are you who we're expecting, or who should we expect someone else? And Jesus sends back a message and says, you know, the dead are being raised and sick are being healed, you know, and that sort of thing. And I found that little moment interesting, and I think I kind of feeling there's something more behind that. There was some sort of dynamic going on there, like maybe John didn't expect to be imprisoned if Jesus was the Messiah or something like that. Just a weird sort of dynamic there.
Either that or the Gospel of John made it up. It's only in the Gospel of John.
Oh, yeah, well, true, that too.
So, I mean, it's probably more about distancing John the Baptist from Jesus, I think.
Yeah, right.
And making sure he's seen as the one pointing towards Jesus rather than someone who Jesus once followed.
Yeah, I mean, our trouble in doing this kind of historical reconstruction stuff is that we have limited sources. We have events that happened in the year 30, say. We have a critical thing that happened in the year 33 by tradition, you know, the crucifixion, death, and then resurrection of Jesus. We have preaching about Jesus for some decades, telling stories and passing on the stories. And then we have the Gospels written. And even at the earliest dating that really, really conservative authors give to John's Gospel, we're still talking about 20 years, if not 25 years between Jesus and that time. And then, of course, with Luke writing after, as we saw last week, writing after the temple destruction, decades later. So there's a lot that has gone on in that early time that is not reported, because whilst it might have been important at the time, from the perspective of people writing it later on. This is what I want to say. And knowledge that Jesus had been a student of John or part of John's movement and then broke away and formed his own one. You counter that by saying, well, John pointed to Jesus. John said he's the one that's greater. So you kind of rework that John-Jesus interaction,
Yeah, interesting.
It's also worth remembering about water is that Jews don't baptize. What John's doing is highly irregular and very unusual. The only time Jews baptize people is someone who is not a Jew becoming a full Jew. That's a proselyte who decides to actually enter the full religion and follow the law, get circumcised if they're a male, etc., etc.
Right.
So that's the only time baptism happens in Judaism. So for John to be baptizing to cleanse people from their sins does suggest an origin other than his home religion, if you like. And the Essenes would be the most logical source of that, because they use water a lot in sense of cleansing. Any other questions?
Thanks.
Are you saying the Essenes were not a Jewish sect?
No, they are, but they're just an irregular one.
So the Essenes were at Qumran, is that right?
Yes, that's right. The Essenes, as John said, they saw them as, they had what's called remnant theology. They saw themselves as small, but the true Israel doing the true things, which is curious given baptism and water really don't feature much in the Old Testament at all. But they developed their own rituals and their own way of doing things, but they're certainly an offshoot of Judaism or a sect of Judaism.
All right, so there's all kinds of interesting speculations then that hover around John the Baptist, and the fact that, I mean, this group that James is studying, the fact that they are a living religion that has lasted right through all of that time, and there are communities in the Middle East, there are communities in Britain, in Australia, I think in the US, indicates something of the like the importance that John was seen in that community, and the fact that there's literature from them gives us interesting points of comparison. We probably should draw it back into our Advent focus, coming back to thinking about John, and we
have some homework.
Yes,
for you. Tuggeranong people, you better know the meaning of this or I'll be very upset. But for the rest of you, if you haven't heard it, I'd like you to look up the Greek word metanoia. It's usually translated as repentance. I'm going to say that's not a good translation or an entire one. Have a look at what meanings it has and how it relates to what we understand repentance to be, because it's relevant to our reading next week, because John does not just tell people to metanoia. He actually begins to suggest to them how they might do that. And that is the really interesting part, and that's unique to the Gospel of Luke, because John does not do this in Mark or Matthew or the Gospel of John. So if you can all make a note of that. And I think John's got some, if he hasn't sent them out, there's articles and there's podcasts and there's various things you can look at on the Essenes, not the Essenes, on the Mandeans, which we can send to you.
Yes, that's on the last page of the resource material that was sent out.
Okay, so you can have a look at them, and there's a little documentary on them that's worth watching. I think it's by the BBC or the ABC. And then you can listen to them talk about themselves, and also James talk about them as well. Well, I hope everyone has a good week, and we'll hopefully see you all next week to discover the real meaning of metanoia and what John the Baptist is talking about.
Yep. Bear fruits worthy of metanoia is the topic for next week, and we're looking at the rest of what is in Luke 3 about John the Baptist. So John gets 2 weeks out of this study.
He's doing very well.